Guys, I thought I would record a video so this time you had some sound and I would take a much quicker time to deliver the content to you, and you could do some application as soon as possible. So what do we want to achieve today? Well, our overall goal is that we want to develop an understanding of St. Anselm's ontological argument, and we'll define what ontological is in a minute. Okay, so to do that, we need to achieve the 3 success criteria, which means that we need to name, define, and interrelate key terms. And as you can see, we're going to do that by interrelating all these key terms that are represented by the pictures of our concept map. So we're definitely going to try and do that. We're going to derive St. Anselm's proof of the existence of God by exploring his categorical deductive argument, and then we're going to come up with an evaluation provided by Kant. So write these down and score yourself out of 4 on each of them, and then I want you to draw me a picture of somebody or something that represents perfection. Cheers. Okay, so for the sake of being quick, let's go through the presentation. The first thing we need to talk about is, what does ontological mean? Ontological means anything to do with reality or anything that is real outside the perspective of our subjective mind. And another way that we refer to that in philosophy is saying phenomenal experience. So anything ontic or ontological is real outside of our subjective experience. Take a note. Now, what does that mean? It means that rather than our impression of what a whiteboard looks like, or rather than our impression of what a book looks like, the ontological nature of things is what the book actually is that's triggering our vision, our impression. So take a note. Now, this man here, St. Anselm, wanted to develop a deductive argument that explores the ontology of what God is. Take a note. And he wanted to explore the ontology of what God is. That means what God is outside of our subjective mind's idea of what God is, by exploring this notion of hierarchy. All right? Take a note. So what he gets us to look at is the definition of God. And he says that everybody can agree that the definition of God is a being of which nothing greater can be conceived. Take a note. Now, the point with this is that if everybody is kind of agreeing on the same idea and the same definition, then there must be some external truth or ontological truth behind it. Because how else would these different subjective minds come together and form and agree upon the same definition? So there must be some kind of ontological reality behind the definition if a lot of people can agree on it. And that includes a fool. Even a stupid fool can understand that this is the definition. Take a note. So here's a picture of my fool, and there's the definition. And as you can see, as we relate these terms, and as I'm pointing to these pictures that represent like hierarchy, God, fool, idea, we can see that we are achieving our first success criteria, which is defining and interrelating key terms to develop an argument to understand where St. Anselm's coming from. So, therefore, he uses this definition to prove that God exists because, and this is really, really important, if you are the highest state of perfection, if you're right at the very highest state of perfection, then you need to exist. And the way that we can really define that is by saying, okay, can you imagine the perfect being? Can you imagine a being of which nothing greater can be conceived? And you say, yes, I can imagine it. All right, well, I can do you one better. I can conceive of an even greater being, and it is the greater being that actually does exist. That's better than the imaginary one. Take a note. So therefore, according to St. Anselm, the argument goes as follows. The most perfect being that can be conceived is a being that actually is perfect and does exist. because not existing would make you less perfect on the hierarchy. Take a note. And this other philosopher, Descartes, kind of reformulated it and made it a bit simpler to understand. And here it is in standard form. I'd copy this down if I were you. God is the perfect being, the greatest being that can be conceived. Being perfect implies existence. That's why I've got here imply and the reader having to infer, right? To be perfect, it implies that you have to exist. Therefore, God exists. Take a note. That's Descartes' version of the ontological argument. Take a note. Now, Immanuel Kant had a really good criticism here. And what's worth noting too that Immanuel Kant is actually a Christian, but he didn't think that the ontological argument was good enough. He thought that it was a bit weak. He came up with something which is called the transcendental argument. But Immanuel Kant asks us to consider, and this is going to seem like a bit of a tangent, about what is $100, all right? And he says, look, you can imagine $100 in your pocket, or you can imagine $100 not in your pocket. But when you do both, you actually don't change the concept of what $100 is. And in this case, and you might want to write this down, when we describe something, or when we give describe something as a concept, or we explain what something is, that means we're defining a predicate. Take a note. Defining a predicate, in this case, means describing what something is. Take a note. And what it gets us to understand is that if the imaginary money in our pocket, or actually in our pocket, the real money in our pocket, the concept of $100 doesn't change, even if it's real or isn't real. So therefore, he says, look, a concept can remain the same, it doesn't change, but its existence or non-existence can change. So therefore, existence is not a predicate. In other words, existence can't be used to describe what something is. Take a note. And I want to work this through with you individually. If the subject is real or not, its qualities don't change, therefore the existence is not a predicate. A subject is the thing performing the action, and its qualities are its predicate. So the things that it has are its predicate. And so it's performing the action of having these qualities. And if they don't change, based on whether it exists or doesn't exist, therefore existence cannot be a predicate. Now this is a bit more complex, and I will talk to you about it in class at some stage. But what you really need to understand is this, as if the $100, the concept of the $100 doesn't change if it exists or doesn't exist. Its predicate doesn't change. And therefore existence isn't a predicate, because the concept of the $100 stays the same if it exists or doesn't. So therefore, saying that perfection implies the meaning of existence is wrong, because you can't say that God is a thing that exists. That's the definition of God. You can't say that God is the thing that exists, because in the process you're saying that existence is a predicate. The concept of God doesn't change if he does or doesn't exist. That's basically what Kant is saying by exploring the $100 note. Take a note. All right, so let's just quickly analyze a little bit of writing from the point of view of our main man, St. Allenson, because he goes a bit deeper here, and he wants to explore the difference between understanding and saying, because he does make a distinction. He thinks that understanding something is very different than being able to formulate an idea with words. So let's quickly read through this and point out what he's saying. Chapter 4, how the fool managed to say in his heart that which cannot be thought. All right. How in the world could we have said in his heart what we could not think? Or how indeed could he not have thought that he said in his heart, since saying it in his heart is the same as thinking it? What he's basically saying here in these two lines is, how's it possible to know something in your heart but to think something different? And this is where he's getting really deep. He's saying people could think God doesn't exist, but they know it in their heart. That's what he's arguing. But if he really thought it because he said it in his heart, and did not say it in his heart because he could not possibly have thought it, and that seems to be precisely what happened, then there must be more than one way in which something can be said in one's heart or thought. Don't worry about that too much. Let it wash over you a bit, okay? For a thing is thought in one way when the words signifying it are thought. Write that down. What he's basically saying is he believes, in this sentence here, a thing is thought in only one type of way when the words you use are forming the thought. Take a note. Then he goes on to say, and it is thought in quite another way when the thing signified, so the thing that you're trying to talk about, that's what signified means, is understood. So he's saying, and you need to write that down, he's basically saying it's understood in a very different way when the thing that we're talking about is understood. So saying something forms a thought that is very different from thinking something that is understood. Take a note. God can be thought not to exist in the first way, but not in the second. This is a really important argument for him. He's saying that God can be thought to exist in word form, right? But it can't be thought to exist in proper understanding, which is what the second is. Take a note. For no one who understands what God is can think that he does not exist. So in other words, he's going back to the ontological definition here. He's saying, if you properly understand the definition of God, you can form a thought. You can say God doesn't exist, or God, you can form a thought that says God doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean you properly understand what God is what is effectively saying. And if everybody does understand properly what God is, then you cannot, he's arguing, logically conclude that God does not exist, because you understand that God is the perfect being and perfection implies existence. Take a note. Even though he may say those words in his heart, he will give them some other meaning or no meaning at all. So in other words, he's saying if he properly understands the meaning of God and what God is, then he has to conclude that God exists. He may say that God does not exist, but that his heart may think something different. Take a note. For God is that greater than which that cannot be thought. Whoever understands this also understands that God exists in such a way that one cannot even think of him as not existing. In other words, if you properly understand the definition of God, you understand that the most perfect being has to be a being that actually exists. And, you can form a thought with words that disagrees with it. But if you fully understand the definition, you can't in your heart really think anything else. Take a note. Okay, so what have we done today? Well, have we named and defined and interrelated key terms? We certainly have. Have we derived a conclusion about what St. Elmsom's proof of the existence of God is? Yes, he says God is the being of which nothing greater can be conceived. If you come up with the thought of an imaginary perfect being, that's not as perfect as saying a perfect being that exists. So therefore, God must exist, right? And that's reworded in Descartes' way by saying, God is the perfect being, in brackets, the being of which nothing greater can be conceived. Second premise, perfection implies existence. Conclusion, therefore God exists, right? And have we come up with a critical evaluation of it? Yes, we have. We've said, from Immanuel Kant's point of view, existence is not a predicate, because the concept of God won't change if you say that he exists or doesn't exist. And then what we also did was we went further and we looked at St. Elmsom's claim that we can form thoughts with words that disagree with what we properly understand if we understand the definition of God properly. A person, according to St. Elmsom, who fully understands the definition of God cannot conclude that God does not exist, though he may be able to form a thought that disagrees with it with his words, right? Words can signify or come up with different thoughts than what our heart truly understands. That's a really important comment to make. All right, what I'd love you to do right now for me is to go to this pretest, assess for embedding quotes, and I would like you to answer this question. How does St. Elmsom develop a more nuanced understanding, nuanced means detailed, understanding of his ontological argument in this chapter 4 of what we call the proslogian I forget. How does he actually do it? And I've read through it and I've explained it to you. And what I really mean is, how does he move away from just covering this standard form argument and go deeper than the standard form argument here in his chapter 4? And I've already tried to explore that. And you need to embed quotes in your answer and say, well, he's moving away from just talking about this simple standard form argument to stuff that's a little bit more complicated. And he further develops his argument. And here's some evidence and some quotes. Can you do that for me? All right. Thank you very much. Cheers.